Welcome to the Harp and Shield. A few days ago, the Plain Bagel, a quite large financial YouTube channel, released a video called The Cost of Alberta Separatism, where he lays out the economic case in pretty bearish terms for Alberta independence. And myself, as an Alberta separatist, I took a look at it and I wanted to engage with it and figure out where the opposing views were coming from, what the arguments were, etc. And I'm familiar generally with Plain Bagel's work. I think he's excellent generally. And his videos have been really good. But this one in particular left a lot to be desired. So in a spirit, I'm forming this rebuttal in a spirit of respect and accountability. And what I'm going to do is we're going to go through this video and critique, point out, comment on, or affirm whatever Mr. Bagel is saying. So as a disclaimer, I'm merely an EIT in Calgary here. So there are a few points that are actually out of my league. One point in particular. Whenever I come to a point that I believe is out of my league, I will explicitly state so. Without further ado, let's get to it. So this is the video right here, and we're going to start at the very end of the just quick warm up the Alberta separation explanation that he gives, and we're going to start right at the section he calls transfer payments. So let's see what he's got to say.
Made are largely fiscal in nature.
I'm going to go back a little bit.
Justin Trudeau term, the arguments made are largely fiscal in nature, with one of the main points being around transfer payments. As mentioned, Albertan households have a higher average income, which, thanks to Canada's progressive tax system, also means they tend to pay higher taxes. A good chunk of this taxes goes towards transfer payments, which are distributed among the provinces to cover things like education, healthcare, and social services. But one of these transfers, known as equalization payments, is specifically designed to redistribute revenue from wealthier provinces to those with lower income. To quote, ensure that all Canadians have access to broadly comparable levels of public services. And these equalization transfers have been a point of frustration for the provincial government. While the amounts don't represent an explicit fee charged to Alberta, since all Canadians again face the same progressive tax rates, the province doesn't receive any amount from the transfers, making it a net contributor. And Alberta Premier Danielle Smith argues that when you consider all transfers beyond just equalization, Alberta sends out over $20 billion more annually to the rest of Canada than it receives back in benefits, an amount that represents an average of around $4,000 per capita. So there's this view that Alberta is subsidizing other provinces in the country, and there is some truth to that.
So he's absolutely correct on all of those things, and that definitely drives a lot of the independence sentiment out here. We have received, as he'll mention later on, $0 in equalization since 1965, and equalization was implemented in 1957. And it's actually quite interesting what how the initial equalization started in the history, blah, blah, blah. But basically, almost from the beginning, Alberta has not received any form of equalization payments. And he's actually going to bring up later on how Alberta has experienced deficits, in the past 60 years, and yet has still contributed to equalization payments, has been a have province as is defined by the equalization system. In 2021, there was also a referendum in Alberta to remove equalization, but that didn't go anywhere because it couldn't go anywhere. But that's where the political will is. So I fully agree with you, Mr. Bagel. So far, so good.
This view also extending to Alberta's contribution to the Canada Pension Plan. Much like how Social Security works in the US, every employee in Canada pays a portion of their paycheck towards the CPP. That amount gets matched by their employer and invested to help grow the pot. And when the employee retires, they're able to receive payments from the program depending on their age, contribution period, and their average earnings while they worked. Now, Alberta has a younger than average population, meaning that Albertans tend to make more contributions to the program then they see benefits redeemed. And because of the higher average income, some believe the province has made a disproportionate contribution to the country's pension plan. In fact, one 2023 LifeWorks report estimated that based on contributions, withdrawals, and historical performance, the province's share of CPP sat around $334 billion, representing roughly half of the entire country's plan. Now, the federal act that created the CPP actually allows provinces to leave with their share of the pot to start their own provincial pension plan. Quebec itself has been running an independent pension plan since the beginning. So, as you can expect, there's been a lot of demand to take this money and run.
So, except for that last statement, that was a pretty fair assessment. We'll get into the LifeWorks estimate later and his general objection to the Alberta pension plan. So put a pin in this.
Now we need to highlight that this calculation is very widely contested for reasons that we'll touch on. But the Alberta Prosperity Project estimates that even if the province ended up with just half of this amount, province could achieve a fiscal surplus of $23.6 billion to $45.5 billion by cutting off ties with Canada's federal government, even after accounting for the upfront costs and the ongoing expenses of replacing federal functions.
So again, we're going to get into this a little bit later, but we've contributed more than our population, than the standard population. And so effectively, we would like to see more. And if Alberta were to separate, as is my hope, then yes, we would expect that cash, which is our cash put away, to return back to us. Let's continue.
Which compares to the forecasted multi-billion-dollar deficits the province is expecting
again, the deficits.
In a few years. So you can see the appeal. It's argued that Albertan independence would both decrease taxes and increase the province's budgetary surplus, and eliminating the overhang of federal regulations could bolster investment and economic growth for the province, all of which sounds pretty compelling, except for the fact that it's completely unfounded.
All right, so completely unfounded. Let's see.
As progressive taxes do lead to Albertans paying higher taxes since they earn, again, higher average incomes, and that is being used to help support other provinces in the country. New Brunswick, for example, sees nearly a quarter of its revenue paid for by other provinces via equalization transfers.
So another aspect about the equalization payments, which he essentially brings up, is that not only are we're not simply helping provinces who are struggling, but rather we're enabling policies that result in essentially bad spending habits. Instead of helping, we're enabling. And we're enabling, in fact, a government and a system that actively is striving to throttle Alberta business.
Approximately 20% of the revenue of the provincial budget for the province of Manitoba comes from equalization, mostly from Alberta. 20% approximately of the revenue of the provincial budgets of Prince Edward Island, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick also come. So they're going to be sitting at the negotiating table watching Sugar Daddy say, bye-bye, right? Where are they? So they're going to have a problem. Now, we've given them lots of chances to figure this out and to stop opposing us from developing our resources and stop voting in governments that throw their knee on our economic neck and deprive our children of a prosperous future and indebt them with this out of control spending. But they've chosen the course that they're on, not us.
But there's a whole slew of problems with the estimates being used by the Alberta Prosperity Project here. Dr. Trevor Tombe, a professor of economics and director of fiscal and economic policy at the University of Calgary, for example, nice last name, by the way, has himself pointed out a few issues with the report. Namely, the cost and revenue assumptions used to calculate these generous figures just don't make any sense.
Okay, so don't make any sense. Is that correct?
There are a number of oversights in the calculations. The group completely forgets about old age security and the Canada Child Benefit.
So, claim forgets about old age security. No, it does not. Old age security is found right here and right here. Implications for an independent Alberta. The Alberta pension plan revenue could cover replacing Canadian old age security, okay? Next up, Alberta already has an Alberta Child and Family Tax Benefit. It's not as much as the Canada Child Benefit, but if it made sense to increase it, we would.
Essentially arguing that Albertans will continue to receive these payments without explaining where the $10 billion to fund these programs will ultimately come from. The group,
again, already in the Alberta Prosperity Project breakdown,
also assumes that Alberta could build an entire military presence for just a few $billions, even though the NATO target of 2% of GDP would put the annual spending alone at $10 billion a year.
So he's using the NATO bare minimum 2% as the benchmark for what the minimum of military requires. But that's not necessarily the case. Alberta doesn't need, first of all, to join NATO, and the initial spending costs, since we're already paying for the Canadian military, we would redirect those funds for an Alberta military, plus those initial startup costs, which he, as he rightly shows, $1 to $2 billion. Maybe that's accurate. Maybe it's not, but we don't have to follow whatever NATO says in this case. We would spend whatever reasonably makes sense. This is not a glaring issue.
He would put the annual spending alone at $10 billion a year, an amount that would eventually rise to $25 billion under the new phasing in of the 5% target. Meanwhile, on the revenue side, the group bases oil royalty estimates on an oil price of 85 Canadian dollars a barrel, which at the time of the draft was closer to accurate, given that oil prices spiked in the month the report was released. But today, the Western Canadian Select benchmark, what most Albertan producers receive for their oil, is sitting at just 69 Canadian dollars a barrel, which alone knocks down revenues by $22 billion.
All right, so what's going on in this section? Mr. Bagel's claim is that the Alberta Prosperity Project overestimates, either purposefully or accidentally, the value of oil royalties to the cost of $22 billion to the Alberta government. $22 billion revenue. So let's investigate that claim. Here we have the section in the Value of Freedom that discusses exactly what he's talking about and that he references. And as you can see, so this is the oil revenue for a 2045 production. So this is a projection into the future, 9.5 million barrels per day estimate. With this price, we'll get to that, midpoint of here, with the annual revenue in the future compared to what we currently do, with the difference between. So let's get back to what he claims. My question is, how did Mr. Bagel get this number? So if you attempt to do the math, what ends up happening is this number comes from multiplying 3.8 million barrels per day with a changed price, right, to $69 for the entire year. And that's how you get the difference of $22 billion in revenue, okay? So, first of all, there are multiple problems with this. Obviously, he's trying to point to this box. Not this box. This is just the difference between the future, the projected future, and what we currently do. Secondly, wrong units. At least not consistent units. Everything's in billion, but this is in million. Secondly, this is 2023, which means it's in the past, which means it's realized revenue. And there are two things about that. So if we move that aside, two things about that. In 2023, the actual oil price was averaging-ish 85 Canadian dollars per barrel. So his claim that that's incorrect is actually he misfounded himself, because that was what was realized. Furthermore, this is what the Alberta government actually received during the year of 2023. So here we have bitumen royalties, and then the other non-renewable resource revenue royalties as well. And these two numbers create $19.3 billion again. So where does he get the $22 billion? And this is the third problem. The claim of losing $22 billion is completely unfounded because this is what the oil companies themselves receive, of which the Alberta government takes royalties off the top. He should have realized this by simply looking at the calculation itself. This is 3.8 million barrels times the actual price for that barrel times the year. It's not as if the Alberta government has the barrel, the companies have it. So, all in all, just really sloppy work on this slide. So let's go back so we can...
Under this plan, about $23 billion, or essentially the entire fiscal surplus on the low end, appears to come from the returns and contributions by Albertans to the Canada Pension Plan.
All right. This is a critical error that he makes, so let me go through it a little bit. What he's claiming is that 16% of Alberta's revenue comes from the Canadian Pension Plan, but it seems like he didn't consider the document at all, because total revenue, as you can see, is this federal taxes retained value plus the provincial equals the total revenue, right? This is the pension, the Alberta Pension Plan revenue. So we're using the pension to fund the pension. Furthermore, he should have realized his mistake because he mentions, 16%. That's the 16%. But that's never how percentages are calculated. You always have to include the numerator in the added denominator. So if you actually do the math out, it should be 14%. I don't know how he didn't catch this. However, it's still completely irrelevant because that's just the pension. It's not part of revenue.
So I guess Alberta will just commandeer pensioner income to fund its independence.
So this statement, I believe, comes from his misunderstanding of APP, which is not Alberta Prosperity Project in this case, but Alberta Pension Plan. Regardless, even in the context, assuming that he made this error, this is a straw man argument and is absolutely unbecoming of a channel like this.
That also brings us to the issues with that calculation of Alberta's share of the CPP, because even with just using half that estimate, the assumptions being used here just aren't realistic. In fact, if other provinces used the same assumptions that were used in the LifeWorks report, there wouldn't be enough money to go around. Ontario and Alberta alone would take up the entire pot of money.
So I tried to find that calculation. I couldn't find it. Perhaps it does exist. I would like to see that exact breakdown.
Reason being that the LifeWorks calculation is oversimplified and doesn't account for the full impact of withdrawals on investment returns, nor the influence of worker mobility. You see, it's very common for Canadians from other provinces to move and work in Alberta when they're young, especially in the oil and gas sector, and then retire and receive their government benefits in a different province, which has contributed to Alberta having the lowest age demographic among the provinces.
So this claim that there are young people in Alberta who come to Alberta, work, move away, I couldn't find any evidence for that. And when I tried to figure out a good way to see it, looking at, StatsCan, provincial migration, I found that people of all age groups were coming into Alberta. And as you can see here, so let's take a look at these seniors. So in the past 4 years, these were the seniors and all the way down who came in, and on the right, we see the seniors who left. And you'll notice that in every single case, with the exception of 2020, 2021, the migrants in always are greater than the migrants out for all of these seniors. And I wanted to look more into this, so let's take a look at what it did. This is a chart using that StatsCan data. Simply, I'm looking at migrants in minus migrants out to get a migrant net in Alberta. Every green box is whenever there was a age group and a year of migrants coming in, and red is migrants going out. Pretty simple. Everything in bold, as you can see, is senior level. And as you can see, the only real times where young people are coming in and old people are leaving, like 2014, 2015, a few in the 06, 07s, but it's not that much. Like 100 seniors came in, whereas like all these young people came in or left. And the pattern that he's talking about, young coming in, old leaving out, I just don't see in the data. Especially in these past 3 years where everyone of all age groups, Alberta had a massive migrants coming in from other provinces. Now, in the context of the pension plan, this is always, we're talking about people who have paid into the pension plan. And there have been, obviously, immigrants from outside of Canada also coming in, which are going to change these numbers as well. And they haven't contributed to the CPP, so they wouldn't be taking payments out. However, I simply cannot find evidence that young are coming in, old are leaving.
This can skew the numbers, making it look like Albertans are paying for the retirement of other Canadians, even if that isn't really the case.
Again, no proof.
So even the Prosperity Project's 25% assumption is an aggressive estimate when you consider Alberta represents just 12% of the country's population and 16% of the CPP's contribution.
Okay, 12% population, 16% CPP contributions. Whatever the number is, that's what we want if Alberta were to separate. And very likely, as I'm sure Mr. Bagel would admit, it's going to be a larger chunk per capita than another province's. I think that's clear.
Contributions. So right away, there are some pretty glaring issues with the fiscal utopia that's being promised for Alberta separation. Then there's the risks, downsides, and costs that...
All right, risks, downsides, and costs. Excellent. Let's get into that.
Haven't been covered here. For one, there's the pretty obvious issue of Alberta becoming a landlocked nation between Canada and the US, which, aside from the military and border implications, also presents a pretty big...
The landlocked question. Honestly, when I first heard it, I didn't think it too big of an issue, but people tend to consider it very highly. So let's get into it.
Big issue for trade. Alberta is already the most US trade-dependent province in Canada.
Oh, man. Most US trade-dependent province in Canada. Oh, man, if only we foresaw that. Oh, shoot. Oh, wait a minute. Oh, yeah. Because all projects to the Energy East and Northern Gateway and going to maybe the Hudson Bay for Germany and Japan to possibly get our oil to international markets. We are landlocked, yes, but landlocked, as I'm going to show a clip here in a little bit, is a matter of policy as well as geography. Alberta is landlocked now. That is just the reality. Let me put up that map again. Northern Gateway rejected. Energy is canceled. Keystone XL gone. We are heavily dependent on the states because that's the only direction we can perhaps possibly go.
Sending the vast majority of its oil down south. And any access to Canada's west coast, where the province currently sells its oil to China, would have to go through British Columbia. So not only would Alberta immediately lose access to CUSMA and the Canadian Free Trade Agreement with other provinces, but it would also have to renegotiate these trade relations from a pretty disadvantaged position.
So disadvantaged position, this is interesting. So the assumption is that Alberta is far more free within Canada than outside. However, that actually is not the case. So I'm actually going to let Keith Wilson, constitutional lawyer, explain this aspect of Alberta landlockedness to you.
75% of the containers ships that come from Asia, from Vietnam, from China, from Korea, from all of those countries that make all of the goods that people buy at Canadian Tire and Walmart stores in Toronto and in Ontario and Quebec come through Alberta on containers that offload at Prince Rupert and the Port of Vancouver. So what's remarkable right now is that your friend from Korea will know about this as a constitutional expert. Yeah. He'll be able to explain to you Section 92 of the Constitution Act, formerly the British North America Act of 1867. I'm sure he's intimate with it. And what the Constitution says is that the reason we say that Canada is a confederation of provinces is because there's an overarching authority of the federal government to ensure, get ready for this, that no one province can block another province's goods from passing. So the idea
now we can't stop them.
The idea is that Alberta cannot stop goods from traveling, BC goods from the $17 billion worth of goods that travel through the rail lines and highways through Alberta each year. Yep. We can't stop that. And it also is supposed to mean under the Constitution,
right,
that the Premier of British Columbia, Mr. Eby, and First Nations cannot say to Alberta, you cannot have a pipeline to the coast. Right. That's the Constitution. Okay. Carney has come out and said effectively, I don't care what the Constitution says. I realize no province is supposed to have this authority to block another province from shipping their goods to market, but I am going to give that authority to Premier Eby, and I'm going to give it to the First Nations, and they have a veto. And he uses his word salad nonsense, and he talked about when the MOU came out, there's necessary conditions and then there's sufficient conditions. And one of the sufficient conditions is that he will not approve a pipeline unless Eby says yes and the First Nations say yes. That is completely contrary to the Constitution. It's another illustration why Alberta needs to become independent, because not only is the structure of our province,
so essentially, Mr. Bagel claims that we would be in a disadvantaged position. I think I would argue, and Mr. Wilson here would also argue, that as an independent state, Alberta would have a much stronger negotiating power through its rail line and through a gas line to BC, which occurs earlier on in this interview, that we would currently have at our disposal. So if Canada, in the case of Alberta independence, wants to play hardball, we can also play hardball to our mutual detriment. So let's not go there. There's another one here.
This idea that we're landlocked, of course, it's a function of geography, but our ability to do anything about it is purely a function of policy, as Tanya rightly points out. And by being an independent country, we will be able to have a serious negotiation. So if EB,
So there we go. Landlock is a matter of both geography and policy. And right now we have been landlocked. Let's see if I can get that map. Landlocked essentially at every turn.
And even without implementing explicit tariffs, it's likely that trade costs would increase. As highlighted by Dr. Tombe, research on Brexit has found that non-tariff barriers increased by 3 to 8% for the UK after it left the EU, with estimates for the impact on GDP ranging from 2 to 5%.
So, as I said in the beginning, this is the particular spot that I'm actually not equipped to respond to, though I do have questions. I do question perhaps that using Brexit as a model for Alberta independence may not be the best way to see it.
For Alberta, a 5% increase in trade costs alone could cause its economy to lose out on an estimated $20 billion annually.
So I would like to see, I read Dr. Tombe's article. It was not, it raised competent issues. This is a very specific and perhaps detrimental issue that could be in a bit independent Alberta's wake or future. So I would really like to see an expert treatment or a debate on this particular aspect. Dr. Tombe's article, though, was not a complete treatment. It was very, very short and wasn't exactly comprehensive for the considering the value of considering the value of freedom document that the Alberta Prosperity Project has come out with. I also wonder about this particular calculation. Is a 5% increase actually expected, perhaps? Again, using Brexit as a model. So if most of our trade goes to the States, right? If most of our trade goes to the States, why would we expect that to increase? An independent Alberta would seek to decrease any friction, especially in our oil patch, between us and the States. So perhaps this is true, perhaps it's not. Assuming it's true, a $20 billion hit, I think we could still take.
Secondly, there's a risk of capital and human capital flight here. The truth is that companies and investors don't like political instability.
So yeah, Mr. Bagel's absolutely right on this front. No business likes political instability, which is why we're already ensuring a smooth and steady transition. This is not a snappy thing. This is going to be drawn out over a long period of time. And we're going to do our best to ensure that business can still function and go about their business without any disruption.
Or the risk of losing access to nearly 90% of Canada's population. So there's a good chance that we see companies and employees leave the province, thereby shrinking the tax base and hurting economic activity, even just on the threat of secession.
All right. So if Alberta wants to become a better place for business, independence is a way for Alberta to become better for business. Now, let's consider his argument for human flight.
Actually saw firsthand with Quebec. From 1976 to 1979, while the Separatist Parti Québécois was in power, an estimated 368 businesses moved their headquarters out of the province, with even the Bank of Montreal moving to Toronto, Ontario. This is also an issue given Alberta's dependence. So, as I've often heard just from people on the street, he's using Quebec's stint in the 70s to say that companies would flee Alberta in the case of separation. Mr. Bagel conveniently forgot about the 1977 Chartre de la Langue Francaise, which established the language police, which established the official and common language of Quebec to be French, and that to be legislated the language of business, which occurred in, again, 1977. And many companies cited this exact bill, so
Bill 101, Le Chartre de la Langue Française, as the reason why they left. Policyholders, for example, at Sun Life Assurance, voted overwhelmingly in Toronto yesterday to establish its headquarters in Toronto. The reason that has been invoked by the company's directors was that as a Canadian and international concern, it could not easily comply with a Quebec language law requiring the use of French in most business dealings. Same thing with a few others. Quebec's language law puts companies to flight. This is an archive from, both these were archived from 1978. So the reason why companies fled Quebec is because Quebec became hostile to business, specifically English business. And Montreal being both the hub of business and also the hub of Anglophones, when Le Chartre de la Langue Française came out, what was there to be expected?
On labor from other.
Oh, and one other thing. Oil companies don't leave the oil.
Provinces, especially for its oil, gas, and construction industries. So any barrier on labor mobility is going to be a meaningful headwind here. Then there's the question of money. Like actual money. What would Alberta use as its currency if it were to separate?
So before I address this, I want to stress, while I do my best to research the topics and find primary sources, etc., and I'm still human. So if I've made any substantial errors, I will be pinning them down below in a comment for people's review.
The Alberta Prosperity Project proposes that the province adopt the US dollar for some reason.
No, not for some reason. So let's take a look at that. Here we have the list of countries using the US dollar outside of the US. Some other countries link their currency to the US dollar at a fixed exchange rate. So for example, Bermuda and the Bahamas can be freely exchanged 1-to-1 for USD. Argentina uses fixed 1-to-1 exchange rate between the Argentina peso and the US dollar. Currencies of Barbados, Belize, Netherlands, Antillean guilder are pegged at the dollar fixed rate of 1.1 to 1.79. I actually want to stress this last sentence on the Wikipedia article. Several oil-producing Arab countries on the Persian Gulf, including Saudi Arabia, peg their currencies to the dollar. So perhaps not for some reason. So let's actually take a look. So I looked into the Saudi Rial and its history, and there was quite a few complexities, but essentially they were consistently using the US dollar as a benchmark for what it's worth. So it's generally around one USD is 3.75-ish Saudi Rials, and that's been that way so for the past 5 years. So using the US dollar is not actually that far out there, and in fact would actually lend stability to an independent state of Alberta, which obviously Mr. Bagel is very concerned about. It was very kind of him.
And eventually transition to its own Albertan dollar backed by gold, Bitcoin, and oil, but doesn't account for the cost of setting up those reserves, nor the risk of a province that's a fraction of the country's size launching a new currency from scratch.
Again, this is kind of a moot point. If it makes sense to launch the Alberta dollar, then we'll do it. If it doesn't, then we won't. Also, 4.5 million people-ish is not an entirely small country. It's not a large country, but it's about the same size as certain European countries. It's not unheard of.
And truly, these are just some of the issues of the countless list of risks and costs that just aren't being considered here.
Oh my! So a countless list of risks and costs. Okay, so let's see what he has to say about this countless list. Let's actually go here.
The need to set up a new central bank institution and postal service.
All right, so Postal Service already accounted for in the Alberta Prosperity Project draft. Here we go. Canada Post, already accounted for. Central bank, not too difficult to solve, not rocket science.
Placing infrastructure for healthcare, education, employment insurance, and pension funding.
All right, so healthcare, education, EI, and pension funding. Hospitals are already built. Schools are already built, both managed by Alberta. So 1, 2. EI, not difficult to solve once again in terms of the infrastructure to pay people out. And pension funding already accounted for in the initial, where is it? Right here, EI, CPP, already accounted for. So what else does Mr. Bagel got?
Establishing border patrol for a border that's now over 10 times larger than before.
All right, large border. Let's see what we got here. Oh, yep, already accounted for.
Development of a new legal and court system. The reestablished
Legal and court system, already accounted for. Where is that? Judges. If I actually go back to page 10, it's better breakdown. Federal courts, regulatory, NAVCAN. Already set up.
of international relations without access
not already set up, already accounted for.
Before. The development of a new legal and court system. The reestablishment of international relations without access to Canada's reputation and G7 status.
Let's see. So international relationships already accounted for. International relations and diplomacy. Yeah, estimated cost for federal service in and impelled to Alberta. Yeah, this is the right chart. Already accounted for. Let's keep on going.
Less favorable lending terms given the uncertainty. Alberta.
So less lending terms, again, not difficult to solve.
Share of federal debt that the Canada government might hitch on the province on the way out.
Okay, the share of federal debt. Now, this will be an interesting conversation. It's going to be an interesting conversation to be had to figure out our share of the debt we never asked for and never voted for. So I hope that will be good part of the good faith negotiations that come on through post a successful independence referendum.
Issue of federally owned land. You could kiss Banff goodbye because that's run federally, not provincially.
All right, so yep, Banff, the national parks are indeed federal land managed by the feds, if I recall correctly. Again, part of good faith negotiations.
1% of the land base is owned by the federal government, comprising the First Nation reserves. They don't own the land even on their reserve. It's owned by the federal government. Then a smaller percentage, or another percentage, is the national parks: Waterton, Jasper, Banff, and Wood Buffalo. And then there's 4 military bases. Those lands are owned by the federal government. Everything else is under the control of the Alberta government as the Crown in the right of Alberta. So we would let's say, so we're going to have to place a value on the military bases and the national parks. Well, maybe we're not going to agree on the value. So often what happens when there's a complex litigation and there's a lot of sub issues, you say, all right, let's go to arbitration on the value of that real estate. And both sides will make submissions to 3 disinterested arbitrators, and they will say, here's the value for Banff, here's the value for Jasper, here's the value for Wainwright, Suffield, etc., for the military bases.
Question of Indigenous rights in areas and the need to renegotiate there.
So yeah, regarding the Indigenous population, essentially it's not actually that difficult. If Alberta voted to separate, of which, they would be included, obviously. In the case of a successful referendum, they would have essentially 3 options in front of them. They could either choose to remain in Canada, they could choose to remain in Alberta with exactly the same treaties and privileges, or they could renegotiate those treaties. Again, not super complicated.
Since Quebec, Canadian law has been updated so that it no longer allows unilateral secession. A yes referendum vote may not even lead to independence.
That is correct. Yes, the Clarity Act. So let's go to that. Clarity Act does indeed state that a secession does not necessarily secession referendum does not necessarily lead to secession. However, it does state that good negotiations are expected afterwards. Whereas the Supreme Court of Canada. So again, this is from the Royal Assent of Bill C-20, also known as the Clarity Act. Whereas Supreme Court of Canada has confirmed that in Canada, secession of a province to be lawful would require amendment to the Constitution of Canada, that such an amendment would per force, require negotiations in relation to secession involving at least the governments of all the provinces and the government of Canada, and that those negotiations would be governed by the principles of federalism, democracy, constitutionalism, and the rule of law and the protection of minorities. So, again, part of the preamble. So, yes, the Clery Act does not necessarily mean that a referendum would result in secession, but it certainly would result in negotiations, which at least we got that.
So let's assume we can't reach a good faith resolution and they don't bargain in good faith. The Supreme Court of Canada anticipated that scenario. And in paragraph 155 of the 1998 Supreme Court of Canada reference decision, they acknowledged that one of the scenarios is the parties don't negotiate in good faith. And as such, that does not preclude Alberta from invoking a unilateral declaration of independence. And whether that would be successful or not would be dependent upon whether or not other nations in the world would be prepared to recognize Alberta as an independent country. The most important country for any country in the world that's seeking independence, wherever it's located on the planet, what is the most important country? If they could pick any country to recognize them and only one, which one would they pick?
The United States, for sure.
Right.
Yeah.
And the United States administration has already indicated that they believe strongly in the free will of regions to determine their political destiny. They believe strongly in democracy and democratic principles. And they've indicated that if Alberta lawfully separates and seeks independence, that they would give it recognition.
And of course, the issue of 25% of the province's GDP coming from oil and gas, an incredibly volatile industry to base your economy off of.
All right, so no one denies the need to diversify, but right now, our industry is being intentionally throttled. So even if it were to go up and down, at least more of it would have marginal benefit during the down times than having none of it at all. Second of all, the volatility was also considered and accounted for in the Alberta Prosperity Project document. Page 28. Wow, shit, too low. Yeah, here we go. Risks, reliance on resource, revenues, risk fluctuations, oil price drops impacting revenue, offset by the creation of community endowment trusts. So essentially, we'll cross that bridge when we get to it.
A big selling point for independence here is the idea that Alberta could deregulate and double down on its oil and gas sector to bolster economic activity. But oil can be pretty unreliable. The Albertan government's revenues from oil and gas have fluctuated from as low as 6.5% of their total income to as high as 33.2% in just the past decade alone.
So, actually, let's continue.
In fact, the Alberta government is currently bracing for higher deficits due to currently low oil prices.
Okay, isn't that interesting? So, deficits, we're expecting and have experienced deficits. And tell me, when did we experience equalization payments for those down times? Am I hearing this right? That during these struggles, during times of lack for the province, we still did not receive anything from from equalization payments, but instead actually paid it out to the other provinces.
And we've seen the province struggle during oil gluts in the past. So while oil has historically been a great boon for the Albertan government,
again, we've only ever paid into equalization since 1965.
That might not always be the case. And one of the benefits of remaining as part of Canada is the industrial diversification it provides should things turn sour.
I think myself and many other Albertans would take that risk. And in fact, we would hypothetically take steps to mitigate our own risk ourselves by our own methods, rather than relying on the folks out east who generally do not listen to Albertan concerns, to put it mildly.
Ontario, for example, has fluctuated between being a net contributor and a net recipient of
1965.
equalization payments. And while it's true that Alberta has not received an equalization transfer since the 1960s, it may not always be able to rely on its above average GDP per capita and young demographics. Now, there are currently valid criticisms of federal policies and how they are impacting Alberta. I mean, this is Canada we're talking about. We have a reputation of holding back our industries with red tape. But Alberta doesn't operate in a closed system, so it's actually quite difficult to accurately estimate many of these figures, to quantify its relationship with the rest of Canada when you consider things like labor mobility, military spending, and the federal tax credits and supports given to oil and gas companies that pay for Alberta's royalties.
So he's right. It is difficult to know and take into account the cost to everything, though you can get a pretty good guess. However, this also cuts the other way, where it's difficult to get an estimate on perhaps the drawbacks that might occur or are occurring for the province of Alberta.
But what is almost certain is that secession would prove incredibly challenging for the province of Alberta. And it's very likely that it would cost more than it would save. Canada itself, of course, would suffer as well. Alberta is a very important economy and should be recognized for its contribution to the country. But independence could prove fiscally devastating for Alberta.
Not according to this or any other analysis that I've seen. So I just want to, let's go back to just the main page of the Alberta Prosperity Project document. With all of our federal taxes retained plus our own revenue, in broad strokes, I think this is good enough to get a good country off the ground. And I think many Albertans think the same.
Some may believe it's still worth it. We're really just talking about the economic considerations here. But a vote shouldn't be held under false pretenses. In 2016, there was a lot of misinformation and confusion about Brexit when just over 50% of voters chose to leave the European Union. In 2025, 5 years after officially leaving, polls suggest that the majority of respondents ultimately believe it was the wrong decision. Now, as mentioned, Albertan separatists do currently remain a minority in the province, and there is a good chance that the provincial government is using the movement as a bargaining chip in its relations with the federal government.
So it's actually interesting. I spoke with a former professor of mine of history who believes that this is actually the right path forward, is to use separation as Quebec as a tactic to strong on the federal government into treating us better. I personally would rather simply separate.
Premier Daniel Smith has done things like reducing the number of signatures needed to put the referendum to a vote, while also talking about a united Canada.
It's not unilaterally as if Smith is going for complete independence. She's simply, unlike many in the House of Commons, listening to Albertan concerns and allowing discussion to take place.
But with the onslaught of misinformation coming our way and likely to come our way in the future, especially if we approach an actual referendum vote, hopefully this video helped to clear the air.
Misinformation indeed. So, we've reached the end of his video. There is a tendency for folks to label misinformation things that they simply don't want to tangle with, or positions they don't agree with. I'm not saying that Mr. Bagel thinks that. But earlier he called the Brexit voters, of which a slim majority voted for Brexit in 2017, if I recall, 2016, did vote to leave the EU in a fiscal sense. I'm of the opinion, and the medieval classicists were as well, that if, and in fact, the foundations of democracy are of this opinion, that if a idea is good, then it will be, it will convince a lot of people, and vice versa. If a lot of people are convinced by an idea, then at least some part of it is true or good. It might be surrounded by some falsehood, but some part of it is true or good. And the folks out east, and this video as well, make it so that instead of listening to Albertan concerns, simply dismiss them. Just like, in Brexit, misinformation, Alberta independence, rhetoric as misinformation, instead of simply dismissing it, maybe trying to find the part of it that's true or good or understandable would be a better path towards healing this gap that could drive Alberta away. And this video and many out east doesn't seem like those concerns are listened to. If you like this video, thank you so much for watching. I have quite a few videos coming down the pipe, one of which is how the Canadian identity has become in modern times prejudiced against America, and you won't want to miss it. So if you're interested in that and perhaps some other things that I might do, please consider subscribing, and thank you so much for watching.